The 4th of March 1944, Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York. Louis Lepke Buchalter is 47 years old, and the state is preparing to kill him. Outside these walls, his name has been connected to labor rackets, extortion, narcotics, political corruption, and a network of killers that newspapers helped immortalize as Murder Incorporated. Inside the death house, none of that power matters anymore. The men who once feared his orders cannot stop the guards. The businesses that once paid to avoid trouble cannot buy him another appeal. The underworld alliances that helped make him one of the most formidable racketeers in New York have failed to keep him out of the electric chair. 2 other condemned men, Emmanuel Weiss and Louis Capone, are scheduled to die the same night. But Buchalter is the name that gives the execution its historic weight. He is not a gunman from the bottom of the organization. He is a boss-level figure, a man who built influence not by standing on the street corners, but by learning how to control entire industries without legally owning them. For years, manufacturers, contractors, truckers, union officials, and workers could all find themselves trapped inside systems where labor disputes became opportunities for extortion. A strike could appear. A shipment could stop. A factory could face sabotage. Then someone connected to the racket could offer the solution. Pay the right people, cooperate with the right union faction, use the right trucking company, and the problem might disappear. Buchalter understood that the most profitable violence was not always the violence that made headlines. Sometimes the threat was enough. Sometimes a beating was enough. Sometimes a businessman paid because he knew what could happen if he refused. That machinery helped make Lepke rich and powerful. It also created enemies, witnesses, and evidence. By the late 1930s, federal investigators were closing in on his racketeering operations. Buchalter became a fugitive, one of the most wanted criminals in the country, before surrendering in 1939 through an extraordinary arrangement that brought radio columnist Walter Winchell and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover into the same episode. Even then, the story was not over. Federal charges could send him to prison. But another danger was growing in Brooklyn. Men who had worked inside the killing system were beginning to talk. Assassins who had once depended on silence were becoming government witnesses. Old murders were being reconstructed. Orders were being traced upward. And one killing became more dangerous than the rest. The 1,936 murder of Joseph Rosen, a former trucking industry figure whom prosecutors said Buchalter feared could provide damaging information. Lepke did not personally fire the bullets that killed Rosen. He did not need to. That was the entire point of the system he had helped build. Orders could travel downward through intermediaries until the boss was separated from the body by layers of men who understood that asking questions was dangerous. For years, that distance protected him. Then the distance collapsed. Testimony connected the command structure back to Buchalter, and the murder designed to remove a potential witness became the case that would ultimately send him to the chair. That is the paradox of Lepke Buchalter. He helped turn organized violence into something resembling a business service, controlled, delegated, and hidden behind structure. But every layer of that structure created another person who knew something. Every killer was a potential witness. Every intermediary was a possible break in the chain. By the time New York was ready to execute him, Lepke's greatest source of protection had become the evidence against him. The electric chair was only the ending. To understand how he reached it, we have to go back to the Lower East Side, to a boy called Lepke, long before businessmen feared his name, and long before murder became part of the machinery of his empire. Louis Buchalter was born in 1897 on Manhattan's Lower East Side, into a Russian Jewish immigrant family living in one of the most crowded urban environments in America. His parents had come to the United States from Eastern Europe, part of a massive migration that transformed neighborhoods below Houston Street into a dense landscape of tenements, pushcarts, sweatshops, small factories, synagogues, street gangs, and families trying to climb into stability one generation at a time. Louis was not born into organized crime. and nothing about his family made a criminal future inevitable. In fact, the contrast inside the Buchalter household would later become one of the most revealing parts of his story. Several of his brothers pursued respectable careers, including medicine and pharmacy. They entered the professional world. Louis moved in the opposite direction. His childhood nickname came from the Yiddish diminutive Lepke, meaning something like Little Louis. Over time, Lepke became Lepke, and the affectionate family name would eventually belong to one of the most feared racketeers in the United States. The transformation was gradual. Buchalter's father died while Louis was still young, weakening the household at a vulnerable time. His mother later left New York for health reasons and went west, while Louis remained behind. It is tempting to turn those losses into a simple psychological explanation for everything that followed, but the evidence does not justify that certainty. Many children in the Lower East Side experienced poverty, bereavement, unstable households, and discrimination without becoming professional criminals. What matters is that Buchalter increasingly chose the street over the legitimate paths visible around him. He began stealing. Small theft led to repeated arrests. By his teens and early adulthood, he was moving through reform and prisons rather than classrooms or apprenticeships. Each incarceration brought him into closer contact with men whose criminal experience was greater than his own. Prison did not create Lepke Buchalter, but it gave him access to a social world where robbery, fencing, stolen property, intimidation, and organized violence could become careers rather than isolated offenses. He learned one lesson especially well. Street crime paid quickly, but organization paid repeatedly. A thief had to steal again every time he wanted money. A racketeer could create a system in which other people produced the revenue. That distinction would define his rise. Around this period, Buchalter formed a relationship with Jacob Shapiro, better known as Gura. Shapiro was physically imposing, aggressive, and deeply comfortable with violence. Buchalter was more reserved. Later descriptions often emphasized his quiet manner, almost as if the absence of theatrical behavior made him more unsettling. Together, they complemented each other. Shapiro provided intimidation that could be understood instantly. Buchalter increasingly understood where intimidation could be converted into continuing economic leverage. New York offered the perfect environment for that partnership. The city's garment trades depended on thousands of workers, contractors, manufacturers, delivery routes, unions, and small businesses operating on narrow schedules and thin margins. A delayed shipment could shut down production. A strike could destroy a season. A few men standing outside a shop could frighten replacement workers away. A truck prevented from reaching a factory could cost an employer far more than the price of whatever payment a racketeer demanded. Violence, therefore, did not have to destroy a business to control it. It only had to demonstrate that normal business could be interrupted. Before Buchalter and Shapiro reached the top of this world, older gangsters had already discovered how profitable labor disputes could become. Professional sluggers were hired by competing union factions and employers. One side might pay men to break a strike. Another might pay men to protect it. Gangsters could support a union today and an employer tomorrow, depending on who offered more. To a young criminal like Lepke, this was a revelation. The real commodity was not loyalty. It was coercion. If you could control the men capable of creating disorder, you could sell peace. Buchalter's early arrests had taught him how dangerous conventional theft could be. Labor racketeering offered something much larger. Instead of stealing a coat, he could influence the people who made thousands of coats. Instead of robbing a truck, he could control whether trucks moved at all. Instead of threatening one victim once, he could build a relationship in which businesses paid because the threat never completely disappeared. That was the point where Little Louis stopped looking like a street thief and started becoming something more dangerous. The next stage of his career would not be about taking property from individuals. It would be about learning how to place himself between legitimate businesses and the labor they needed to survive. By the middle of the 1920s, Lepke Buchalter and Jacob Gura Shapiro had moved beyond ordinary street crime into a world where violence could be converted into recurring revenue. The garment trades of New York were especially vulnerable because they depended on timing. Manufacturers needed cloth delivered, cutters working, sewing rooms operating, trucks moving, and finished garments reaching buyers before the season changed. A disruption lasting a few hours could be expensive. A disruption lasting days could ruin an order. That created an opportunity for men who understood that the threat of chaos could be sold twice. First, to the people who wanted trouble created, and then to the people willing to pay to make the trouble stop. Buchalter and Shapiro inserted themselves into labor disputes, union politics, trucking arrangements, and trade associations until they no longer looked like outsiders hovering around legitimate business. They became part of the mechanism through which some businesses expected disputes to be settled. The racket did not require Lepke to own a factory. In some ways, ownership would have been less efficient. An owner had to worry about rent, payroll, inventory, machinery, customers, taxes, and competition. A racketeer could stand outside that burden and still extract money from the people carrying it. If an employer refused to cooperate with a favored union faction, workers could be pressured to strike. If a union leader resisted the wrong men, he might face intimidation from professional sluggers. If a contractor ignored a demand, trucks could fail to arrive, materials could disappear, windows could be smashed, or employees could be beaten. Then someone connected to the same network that created the problem could offer a solution. Pay. Join the approved association. Use the approved trucking company. Accept the approved labor arrangement. The immediate crisis would disappear, but the relationship would remain. That was the genius of the system. A robbery produced one payment. Control over a labor bottleneck could produce payments for years. Buchalter and Shapiro did not invent labor racketeering in New York. They entered a criminal marketplace that already existed, where gangsters hired themselves out to employers, union officials, and political interests willing to use force. One of the important figures in that earlier world was Jacob Little Augie Orgen, a labor racketeer whose organization exercised influence in disputes across the garment trades. Men such as Buchalter and Shapiro learned inside this environment that union conflict could be more profitable than conventional theft because it placed criminals close to legitimate money. A manufacturer might hate paying a racketeer, but he also had payroll to meet and deadlines to satisfy. If the cost of resisting was higher than the cost of paying, extortion could be disguised as a business decision. That calculation gave Lepke power. He did not need every victim to respect him. He needed them to believe he could make refusal expensive. By 1927, the balance inside this underworld was changing. Orgen was murdered on a Lower East Side street, and Buchalter and Shapiro were widely linked in later accounts to the struggle that followed his death and the transfer of labor racketeering power. The exact chain of responsibility for the killing has been described differently across sources, so the important point is not to pretend we can reconstruct every order with certainty. The important point is what happened next. Lepke and Gura emerged with growing control over rackets connected to New York's garment industries. They expanded influence across unions and trade associations, particularly in areas such as fur processing, trucking, and clothing manufacture. In these industries, the criminal opportunity was not simply to extort one shopkeeper. It was to control access to an entire market. Consider what happened when a racket gained leverage over a trade association. Members could be pressured to follow pricing rules. Competitors outside the arrangement could be threatened. Employers might be forced to use certain contractors or transport services. Union officials could be bribed or intimidated into supporting decisions that benefited the racket. The criminal group could then collect from several sides of the same transaction. Workers might be manipulated through a corrupted union. Manufacturers might pay for labor peace. Truckers might pay for access. Contractors might pay to avoid disruption. Every new point of control made the network harder to escape because a business owner could not solve the problem simply by changing one supplier. The problem was the system around him. The federal government would later document how deeply these rackets penetrated legitimate commerce. In the fur industry, investigators found organizations capable of exerting extraordinary influence over production, and prosecutors accused Buchalter, Shapiro, and their associates of using threats, violence, and combinations that restricted competition. The racket could force businesses into associations, dictate terms, and punish companies that refused to cooperate. This was organized crime functioning not as a gang on the edge of capitalism, but as a parasitic management layer attached to capitalism itself. Lepke's strength was understanding where the choke points were. He did not need to supervise every beating personally. He did not need to appear at every factory. He needed reliable lieutenants, corrupt labor officials, cooperative businessmen, and enough violent reputation that most disputes could be settled without visible bloodshed. That last point is crucial. The most successful extortion system is not one that constantly destroys its customers. Dead manufacturers do not pay. Burned factories do not produce. Endless strikes reduce the profits available to everyone. Violence had to be credible but selective. One shattered truck, one assaulted organizer, one businessman made into an example could convince dozens of others to cooperate. Fear scaled better than murder, and Buchalter increasingly built his reputation around that invisible efficiency. Unlike gangsters who turned themselves into celebrities, Lepke did not need newspaper photographers to validate his position. His power appeared in the behavior of other people, employers who paid, union men who obeyed, truckers who followed instructions, and competitors who understood that crossing the wrong line could end very badly. Money from those arrangements flowed upward, expanding his ability to buy protection, hire more muscle, strengthen political connections, and enter additional industries. Each success made the next takeover easier. If a businessman knew that Buchalter already influenced the union, the trucking company, and the association representing his competitors, resistance began to look irrational before a threat was even spoken. This was how Lepke evolved from criminal entrepreneur into industrial racketeer. He had learned that control was more valuable than possession, and that the best racket was one in which legitimate businesses continued operating because their success created the money he intended to extract. By the end of the decade, Buchalter and Shapiro were no longer simply men hired to settle labor disputes. They were helping shape the conditions under which entire sections of New York industry operated. And once Lepke understood that organized intimidation could be standardized, delegated, and used across multiple businesses, he was ready for an even darker idea. If violence could be managed like labor, it could also be managed like a service for the underworld itself. By the early 1930s, Lepke Buchalter had reached a level of power that street reputation alone could not explain. He was no longer simply a labor racketeer extracting money from frightened manufacturers. He had become part of a broader transformation inside American organized crime, one in which local gangs increasingly coordinated across territories, ethnic lines, and business interests because endless warfare was bad for profit. New York's underworld was changing. Older bosses had often ruled through personal loyalty, neighborhood identity, and open violence. The newer generation wanted something more stable. Figures such as Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky understood that organized crime could earn more if major disputes were negotiated before they became wars, if territories were respected when convenient, and if violence was used selectively instead of chaotically. Lepke fit naturally into that system because he already thought like an industrial manager. His labor rackets depended on organization, compartmentalization, and discipline. A businessman did not need to know every man in Buchalter's network. A union official did not need to understand the entire hierarchy. Each person only needed to know who gave the order directly above him and what happened if the order was ignored. That same structure could be applied beyond the garment district. Buchalter became associated with the national criminal network that emerged during this period, a world in which Italian and Jewish gangsters cooperated when money mattered more than old rivalries. He was not the loudest man at the table. He did not build his image around nightclub appearances or newspaper photographs. That quietness became part of his reputation. Men around him understood that Lepke could control violence without needing to perform it personally. Albert Anastasia represented a different kind of power. A fearsome Brooklyn figure with deep connections to waterfront and underworld violence. Anastasia was closely associated with groups of killers operating in Brooklyn neighborhoods such as Brownsville and Ocean Hill. Together, men in this wider syndicate world had access to something extremely valuable: professional criminals who could kill on assignment without the emotional baggage of a personal feud. Newspapers would later give the system a name so memorable that it became larger than the structure itself: Murder, Incorporated. The phrase suggests a formal corporation, as though there were an office, a payroll department, and one unquestioned chief executive. Reality was messier. Murder Incorporated was a journalistic label applied to overlapping networks of contract killers and intermediaries connected to organized crime leaders, particularly crews based in Brooklyn. But the label captured something important. Murder had become organized. A boss with a problem did not always need to recruit his own gunmen, expose his own soldiers, or start a war with another family. The problem could be passed through trusted channels to men whose specialty was violence. That separation created protection. The person who wanted someone dead might never meet the killer. The killer might know only the intermediary who delivered the assignment. Surveillance could be handled by one man, transportation by another, the shooting by another, and disposal by someone else. Every layer made prosecution harder because every layer broke the direct connection between decision and death. For Buchalter, the appeal was obvious. His entire career had been built on the idea that control becomes safer when it is delegated. In the labor rackets, he did not need to smash every truck himself. In the murder system, he did not need to pull every trigger. The important thing was that the order traveled downward, and the result traveled back upward. This was not random gangland chaos. It was violence treated as infrastructure. That distinction also helps explain why Lepke became so valuable within the syndicate. He understood how to convert individual criminals into a repeatable system. A street killer might be dangerous. A network of killers who could be assigned, moved, paid, and separated from the men who benefited from the murder was something else entirely. It could protect rackets across neighborhoods. It could punish defectors. It could remove thieves who stole from their own organizations. It could eliminate rivals whose survival threatened larger agreements. Most importantly, it could silence people who knew too much. That last function would eventually become fatal for Lepke. The more federal and state investigators examined his labor empire, the more dangerous former associates became. A businessman could testify about extortion. A union official could describe payoffs. A trucking operator could explain who controlled a route. A disgruntled insider might connect Buchalter to an entire chain of coercion. In the beginning, Murder Incorporated looked like a solution to those risks. A witness could disappear before reaching court. A potential informant could be killed before signing a statement. A man considering betrayal could be made into an example for everyone else. But every murder required more people to know that a murder had been ordered. The system that protected the boss also created a hidden archive inside the memories of killers, drivers, lookouts, and intermediaries. Lepke could not see the danger yet. At the height of his power, the arrangement seemed almost perfect. He had learned how to control businesses he did not own, unions he did not officially lead, and violence he did not personally commit. The underworld had given him something close to executive power without public office. Then prosecutors began closing in, and Lepke faced a question that would change the purpose of the killing machine. Murder was no longer needed only to protect territory or enforce discipline. It was increasingly needed to erase evidence. By the middle of the 1930s, the murder network associated with Lepke Buchalter had evolved from an underworld enforcement tool into something more dangerous, a system for protecting the system itself. The men later grouped under the label Murder Incorporated were not random psychopaths wandering through Brooklyn looking for victims. They were professional criminals, operating inside relationships built on assignments, intermediaries, money, and discipline. Some came from Brownsville and Ocean Hill. Some had reputations for shootings, strangulations, stabbings, and carefully planned ambushes. Names such as Abe Kid Twist Release, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, Harry Maione, Albert Tannenbaum, Louis Capone, and Emanuel Weiss would later become familiar to prosecutors because they represented different links in a chain that could separate a powerful racketeer from the actual killing. The structure mattered. A boss-level problem might begin with a complaint. Someone had stolen money, ignored an order, threatened to testify, or become dangerous to a larger racket. The decision did not necessarily pass directly from the man who wanted the problem solved to the man who would carry a gun. Instead, trusted intermediaries could move the instruction downward. A crew might follow the target for days. Someone might learn his routine. Another man might provide a car. Another might choose the location. The killer could be told only what he needed to know. That compartmentalization reduced exposure. If police caught the shooter might be several layers removed from the person who benefited most from the death. In theory, this made murder safer for the men at the top. In practice, it created a growing population of criminals who knew pieces of the same hidden architecture. As long as everyone remained loyal, frightened, and alive, the structure worked. Lepke had spent years learning how to make coercion efficient, and now the same instinct was being applied to homicide. Murder was no longer merely retaliation after an insult. It could be preventive. It could remove a witness before a trial, silence a former associate before he reached prosecutors, or eliminate someone whose testimony might expose the relationship between labor unions, businessmen, trucking interests, and racketeers. That distinction is crucial, because Lepke's greatest legal danger was not necessarily the violence people could see. It was the business records and human testimony behind the violence. Federal investigators had begun examining his influence in the fur and garment industries, while New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey was building his reputation by attacking organized crime through conspiracy, vice, and racketeering cases. The more pressure increased, the more valuable silence became. Potential witnesses inside Lepke's labor operations now represented an existential threat. A man who knew how a trucking agreement had been enforced could explain more than a dead body ever could. A former associate could identify names, meetings, payment structures, and chains of command. That meant the murder network could serve a new purpose, not simply punishing enemies, but erasing future testimony. Several killings later examined by prosecutors were tied to this logic. The victims were not always rival bosses or glamorous gangsters. Some were men whose knowledge could damage Buchalter's position if they cooperated with investigators. That is where the system began turning inward. Every witness killed to protect Lepke required killers who understood that the order came from somewhere above them. Every intermediary who transmitted the assignment became another person capable of reconstructing part of the chain. The attempt to eliminate evidence, therefore, generated a second body of evidence hidden inside the people carrying out the murders. For years, fear kept that evidence locked away. The killers understood the consequences of betrayal. So did the men who drove them, housed them, introduced them, or collected payment. But criminal loyalty is strongest when the system appears permanent. Once arrests begin, once prosecutors start offering deals, once men face long prison terms or death sentences of their own, silence becomes a transaction too. That vulnerability was already forming beneath Lepke's feet. One representative case would ultimately prove more important than the mythology of hundreds of alleged contract killings. Joseph Rosen had been connected to the trucking world and had once found himself in conflict with interests linked to Buchalter's rackets. Prosecutors later argued that Rosen possessed information capable of damaging Lepke and therefore became a liability. In September 1936, Rosen was shot to death in Brooklyn. The killing did not look at first like the event that would eventually destroy one of the most powerful racketeers in America. It was another gangland murder in a city that had seen many of them. But the men involved in carrying out such murders were beginning to accumulate exactly the knowledge Lepke could not afford to have exposed. At the same time, the government was tightening pressure on his business empire. What had once looked like a perfect security system was becoming an enormous risk. The killers knew the intermediaries. The intermediaries knew who wanted problems solved. The people protecting Lepke's secrets were also the only people capable of revealing them. And as law enforcement closed in, the question was no longer whether Buchalter could make witnesses disappear. The question was, what would happen when one of his own killers decided that survival mattered more than silence? By 1936, Lepke Buchalter's greatest problem was no longer a rival gangster. It was the government. For years, his power had depended on the assumption that legitimate industries could be penetrated without exposing the men at the top. A manufacturer might know the local collector but not the strategist behind him. A corrupted union official might understand one arrangement but not the entire network. A trucker could be threatened without ever meeting Buchalter. That distance had protected Lepke while his influence spread through parts of New York's garment and fur trades. Then investigators began attacking the structure instead of merely arresting individual enforcers. Federal authorities examined combinations that restricted competition, labor organizations used as instruments of coercion, trucking arrangements, and the intimidation surrounding the fur industry. The pressure was especially dangerous because it treated racketeering as an economic system. Prosecutors did not need to prove that Lepke personally smashed a window or beat a businessman. They could build cases around conspiracy, interstate commerce, antitrust violations, narcotics offenses, and the network of people acting together. Every legitimate company forced into an arrangement became a possible source of records. Every frightened employer was a potential witness. Every lieutenant under indictment became someone who might eventually decide that prison loyalty had limits. Buchalter and Jacob Gura Shapiro had survived years of street violence, but paperwork and testimony were beginning to create a battlefield they could not control with the same ease. By the late 1930s, both men were under intense pressure. Buchalter faced federal indictments and became a fugitive, disappearing while newspapers and law enforcement turned his absence into a national spectacle. The man who had once controlled economic bottlenecks across New York now had to surrender control over his own daily movements. He relied on safe locations, trusted intermediaries, and the discipline of people who understood that revealing where Lepke slept could have deadly consequences. For a racketeer who had spent years building an image of quiet authority, fugitive life carried a hidden humiliation. He could still issue orders, but he could not openly enjoy the power those orders represented. He could not move freely through the city, whose industries had once feared his name. Federal agents wanted him. Local prosecutors wanted him, and every month he remained underground increased the danger that someone near him would decide the reward for cooperation was greater than the reward for loyalty, the Doubleday. The pressure finally produced one of the strangest surrender stories in American organized crime history. Buchalter did not simply walk into a precinct. Contacts were made through the nationally famous newspaper and radio commentator Walter Winchell, who had access to both public officials and underworld intermediaries. Negotiations developed around the conditions under which Lepke might safely give himself up. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, became directly involved. On the 24th of August 1939, Buchalter emerged from hiding in Manhattan and surrendered to Hoover in an episode so theatrical that it seemed designed for the newspapers. Winchell was part of the chain that brought the fugitive into federal custody. For a man who had spent his career avoiding publicity, the ending of his fugitive period became a public event. The surrender also created a dangerous illusion. Federal custody could look preferable to the uncertainty of remaining underground. Buchalter knew he faced serious charges, but prison was at least a structured environment. It could be imagined as survivable. He had been incarcerated before. He understood federal cases. What he could not yet fully control was the murder investigation growing in Brooklyn. While the government prosecuted him on federal offenses, detectives and prosecutors were revisiting killings that had once seemed impossible to solve. The Murder Incorporated. structure had been effective because the men carrying out assignments remained silent. That assumption was now beginning to fail. In 1940, Abe "Kid Twist" Relis, one of the most feared killers associated with the Brownsville murder crews, was arrested and chose cooperation over loyalty. His decision changed the balance immediately. Relis could explain names, relationships, methods, and old killings from inside the network. Other criminals understood what that meant. If Kid Twist was talking, every murder once protected by fear could be reopened. Every intermediary had to wonder whether Relis knew his role. Every boss had to ask how far the chain could be traced. For Lepke, the danger was catastrophic because his legal problems were no longer separate. Labor racketeering had created potential witnesses. The murder network had been used to remove threats. Now the murder network itself was producing witnesses capable of explaining why certain threats had been removed. Buchalter had surrendered, believing the government already knew enough to imprison him. He was about to discover that his own people knew enough to kill him. Abe Relis did more than confess to murder. He gave prosecutors a map. Until 1940, many of the killings linked to the Brownsville crews had existed as disconnected bodies, unsolved shootings, disappearances, and rumors that detectives could rarely convert into courtroom evidence. Relis changed that because he had worked inside the system. He knew who arranged meetings, who relayed orders, who drove the cars, who watched the targets, and which men were called when someone had to disappear. Once he began cooperating, prosecutors could return to old case files with something they had never possessed before, an insider capable of explaining how apparently unrelated murders were connected. Other members of the network now faced a brutal calculation. Remain silent and risk execution or life imprisonment, or cooperate before somebody else told the same story first. Albert Tannenbaum became one of the most important men to make that choice. His testimony would eventually help prosecutors reach beyond the shooters toward the people who had issued orders. That was precisely the kind of upward movement Lepke Buchalter had spent his career designing the system to prevent. For years, compartmentalization had protected him. Now cooperating witnesses were reconstructing the compartments. The most dangerous reconstruction concerned Joseph Rosen. Rosen had once operated in trucking and had become entangled in the labor world that Buchalter and his associates dominated. Prosecutors argued that Rosen possessed information that could damage Lepke, and that Buchalter wanted the problem removed before Rosen could become useful to authorities. On the 13th of September, 1936, Rosen was shot repeatedly outside a candy store in Brooklyn. For years, the case produced no conviction against Buchalter. The shooters were separated from him by the very layers of organization that made the killing system effective. But once former insiders began talking, prosecutors could describe the murder not as an isolated gangland shooting, but as a command moving downward through a hierarchy. Tannenbaum testified about the order and the people involved in carrying it out. Other testimony helped prosecutors construct the chain linking Buchalter to the decision. Lepke was eventually tried alongside Emanuel Weiss and Louis Capone for Rosen's murder. The prosecution did not claim that Buchalter stood on the sidewalk with a gun. It did not have to. The case was about responsibility at the top of a criminal structure. If the jury believed that Lepke had ordered Rosen killed because Rosen was a threat, then the distance between the boss and the bullets would no longer protect him. That was the reversal Buchalter had never intended. Delegation had once created deniability. Now delegation became proof that an organized system existed. While the murder cases expanded, Abe Relis became one of the most valuable witnesses in New York. His cooperation implicated killers and helped prosecutors pursue cases that had once seemed impossible. It also made him extraordinarily dangerous to organized crime. In November 1941, while under police protection at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Relis fell from a sixth-floor window and died. The circumstances immediately produced suspicion. A witness who knew intimate details about Murder Incorporated had died while guarded by law enforcement officers. Newspapers, detectives, gangsters, and the public All had reasons to wonder whether someone had helped him out the window. Later, official investigation concluded that the fall was accidental, and no murder was proved. But the unanswered questions ensured that conspiracy theories survived. For Lepke, however, the most important fact was simpler. Rayles was dead, and it still did not save him. The prosecution against Buchalter did not depend on a single witness. Albert Tenenbaum remained alive and available. Other evidence and testimony had already allowed prosecutors to build the Rosen case. The very redundancy that had made the killing network effective was now working against the men who created it. One informer could die, but another could still explain the chain. One killer could deny an order, but another could place him inside the planning. The organization had accumulated too many people with overlapping knowledge. In late 1941, the jury convicted Buchalter, Weiss, and Capone of first-degree murder. The verdict carried the death penalty. For Lepke, the legal reality was almost surreal. Federal courts had already convicted him in other cases. He faced years of imprisonment for racketeering and narcotics offenses. But New York State now wanted something more final. His lawyers fought through appeals, attacking the testimony of cooperating criminals and challenging the conviction through the courts. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. In 1943, the court affirmed Buchalter's conviction. The legal avenues narrowed. Political appeals followed, but they failed as well. The man who had once survived by making other people calculate the cost of resistance was now trapped inside a system where every decision had been taken away from him. He could no longer threaten the prosecutor. He could not intimidate the judges. He could not erase the cooperating witnesses who had already testified. Most importantly, he could not reverse the central irony of the Rosen murder. Joseph Rosen had allegedly been killed because his knowledge made him dangerous. Yet the attempt to silence him created a homicide that allowed other insiders to expose Lepke in a far more devastating way. Murder had been designed to close the case before it could begin. Instead, the murder became the case. By early 1944, the appeals were exhausted, and New York prepared to carry out the sentence. Louis Buchalter, Emanuel Weiss, and Louis Capone were transferred toward the same destination where Lepke had once served time as a younger criminal. Sing Sing. The boy who had learned that organization was more profitable than theft had built one of the most sophisticated systems of coercion in New York. Now that system had been dismantled, witness by witness, testimony by testimony, until the orders he once believed were safely buried beneath layers of killers had traveled all the way back to him. The 4th of March 1944, Sing Sing Prison. The story had returned to where it began. Louis Lepke Buchalter was no longer the invisible racketeer behind unions, trade associations, truck routes, and murder contracts. He was an inmate under sentence of death. Emanuel Weiss and Louis Capone were scheduled to die with him. Outside the prison, reporters waited because this was not an ordinary execution. Buchalter had once operated at a level where businessmen paid rather than risk his anger. Union officials understood the cost of resistance, and criminal leaders trusted the machinery surrounding him to solve problems that could not be handled publicly. Now the state had reduced all of that authority to a timetable. Appeals had failed. The United States Supreme Court had upheld his murder conviction. Efforts to stop the sentence had not changed the outcome. When the guards came, there was no intermediary left to call, and no layer of organization capable of placing distance between Lepke and the consequence. The electric chair completed a journey that had begun decades earlier, with a boy from the Lower East Side learning that crime became more profitable when other people did the dangerous work. That idea had shaped everything. As a thief, Buchalter had taken property himself. As a labor racketeer, he learned to make businesses pay because other men could create disruption. At the height of his power, he could influence factories he did not own, unions he did not officially lead, trucks he did not drive, and killings he did not personally commit. His greatest strength was distance. His greatest weakness was that distance required people. Drivers, collectors, union officials, intermediaries, gunmen, accountants, businessmen, and associates all held pieces of the system in their memories. Fear kept those pieces separated for years. Prosecution brought them together. That is why the fall of Murder, Incorporated mattered beyond the sensational nickname. The real collapse was not simply that professional killers were arrested. It was that silence stopped functioning as infrastructure. Abreu talked. Albert Tannenbaum talked. Investigators reopened old murders. Prosecutors learned how to move upward through the chain instead of stopping with the shooter. Joseph Rosen, the man whose death was supposed to remove a possible threat, became the legal bridge between Buchalter and the electric chair. The mechanism had reversed itself. Murder was supposed to erase evidence. Instead, murder produced witnesses who could explain why the evidence had been erased. Buchalter was executed that night, followed by Weiss and Capone. His death was extraordinary, because men at his level of organized crime usually expected prison, exile, negotiated survival, or death at the hands of rivals. Lepke died by order of the state, yet the system he represented did not disappear with him. Labor racketeering continued in different forms. Organized crime continued to infiltrate legitimate industries. Contract killing did not end. Corrupt unions, bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and criminal alliances survived because the underlying lesson Lepke had exploited was larger than one man. If you can control the point where money, labor, transportation, and fear meet, you do not need to own the business to profit from it. What disappeared was Buchalter's belief that the structure could protect him forever. He had spent his career transforming violence from an impulsive street act into something disciplined, delegated, and economically useful. For years, that made him stronger than the men who had to use their own fists and guns. In the end, it also meant that too many other people knew how the machine worked. Lepke Buchalter did not fall because organized violence suddenly stopped being effective. He fell because the secrecy that made organized violence profitable finally broke. And once the men beneath him began explaining the system, the distance between the boss and the body disappeared.